Well, tonight we're looking at the short but powerful book of Obadiah. The background of Obadiah is that God is bringing judgment upon the nation of Edom. And Edom was a nation that was filled with pride. Now, pride is sometimes a difficult thing to discern openly. That is overtly. When we think of pride, we think of someone who is arrogant or conceited, and it's obvious that they are. But at other times, pride can be very subtle, and sometimes people can be very diplomatic, and you don't always see pride on the streets, so to speak. So we want to look at pride tonight because the book of Obadiah is a treatise on pride, and if I were to give a title to the book, I would simply say "The Peril of Pride" because it just leads to so many other sins. And of course, there's a verse in the Bible that most of us are familiar with that pride goeth before destruction. And in other words, pride usually is just before somebody's fall. And we know that on an individual level, the Bible is filled with all kind of examples where because of pride, men have fallen. You think of Haman in the book of Esther, who was filled with pride simply because there was a fellow by the name of Mordecai that refused to bow down to him. Isn't it interesting that our pride can be wounded by such a small thing? And yet we see it all the time, don't we? We'll see that people are hurt or wounded because they feel slighted, or men did not applaud them, or they didn't get the praise. Somebody didn't talk to them, and so their pride is wounded. Something we ought to think about as we're beginning to look at the book of Obadiah is that pride is one of those things that we generally don't think is a big deal. We wouldn't list it as one of the top sins. We could think of a lot of things that are worse than pride, I suppose. And yet God believes that pride is really, really an evil thing. In fact, if we were to take time, it's pride that I think that turned the devil into the devil. And the Bible simply says that that God resists the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. We need to make sure that we're on the side of grace and not on the side of arrogance and pride. And it's important for us to realize, without being too redundant, how terrible that pride is, because pride can lead to so many different things. And so let's look tonight at the book of Obadiah. Now, the background, of course, is that Edom and Israel had some deep hostility. It goes way back in their history. If you remember that when Israel was in the Exodus, leaving the bondage of Pharaoh in Egypt, they were journeying to the promised land, and Edom refused to let them pass through their region. And this hostility continued to the time of David, when David, the first king, or not the first king, but the second king of Israel, had subjected them. But during the days of Jehoram, they had rebelled against Israel, set up their own king. And this is sort of the time that Obadiah had prophesied against the nation of Edom. And so beginning in verse number 3, the Bible says that the pride of thine heart has deceived thee. Now, let's stop there for just a moment, because we got to recognize something here. Pride can actually deceive our own heart. And it can make us think that we're somebody special or better than other people. And there's a story that Jesus told, if you remember, over in Luke chapter 18, about two men that went up to the temple to pray. And what a contrast. One was a tax collector. They were called publicans back there. And one was a Pharisee. And of course, the Pharisees, in the eyes of the people, was the most pious men in Israel. So they both go up to pray, and the Pharisee notice he begins to pray over Luke 18. I'm going to just read that because I want you to see how pride had led to self-righteousness. And this is what he had to say. He said, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even has that tax collector. And he probably was looking over there and happened to see the tax collector and wondering what in the world he was doing at the temple anyhow. In verse number 12, the Pharisee goes on to say, I fast is what I wanted to say. I fast twice a week and I tithe. There's the word that was causing me to stumble for a moment. And I tithe of all that I possess. How remarkable. And then he goes on to say, and the tax collector standing afar off. Now he's standing afar off, and watch it here, because he feels so unworthy even to be there. And he cries out to God. He doesn't even raise his hand. He beats his breast and he cries out to God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now notice this. This would have stunned the audience. We don't get too astonished by it. It doesn't shock us. But notice Jesus said, and he's speaking out loud, mind you, that I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. What a surprise. Now notice his, for whosoever exalts himself, that's pride. And when we're talking about pride, I just want you to remember we're talking about the sordid kind of pride, inordinate pride that causes a man to think more of himself than he ought to. And of course, he expresses that pride in so many, many different ways, oftentimes self-righteously and sometimes very harshly. And so he goes on to say that the man who exalts himself shall be humbled, and he that humbles himself shall be exalted. So look how important that is. Now in Obadiah chapter 3, he talks about how pride has deceived them. And of course they think that they're secure and that nobody can touch them. They think they're somebody else. They think they're above somebody. And that's why he says, the pride of thine heart has deceived thee. Thou dwellest in the clefts of the rock. Thy habitation is high. And they say it in their heart, who shall bring me down? You see, what pride does, it genders a sense of false security. And they think they're okay. They think they're safe. They don't think anybody can get at them. But watch the next verse. In verse number 4, it says, that though you exalt yourself as an eagle, and you know that an eagle can get really far up there in the sky, and thou setst a nest among the stars, and that's from there God says, I will bring you down. So the first thing we notice here in this business of the peril of pride, that God's going to bring him down. And it's important, isn't it, on a national level, that we don't feel self-sufficient and that we are independent of God, and our pride begins to fill our hearts, and we think that we're a nation above other nations, and that's a spooky thing. But on a personal level, it's just as dangerous. That pride begins to fill our heart, and we begin to think we're somebody special, and we look down on people, and we despise others. That's a horrible, horrible thing. Now notice in verse 5, he begins, you're going to see how pride caused them to do some terrible things. And boy, I'm just not going to spend any time there, because the history pages are filled with people who were filled with pride, who thought they were superior to others, and all the hurt that they did. Now notice verse 5. If thieves come to thee, if robbers come by night, would they not have stolen till they had enough? They're just going to rob what they want and take what they can get. But notice Edom, he says, how are those things that Edom searched out? How are the hidden things? I mean, they were so greedy, they were so covetous that they were looking everything under the floor, looking in the cupboards, looking everywhere that they could. They wanted to steal everything. And if you look at the next verse, he'll say, all the men of the confederacy have brought thee even to the border, and the men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee. Now notice what he's saying. Boy, America learned this lesson, I think. we think sometimes that we make treaties with some folks. We got some good treaties in the world. America does. They got some good friends. But sometimes they make some treaties with some real scoundrels that you couldn't trust to throw them across the street. And that's what he's saying. You made some treaties, and these people that you made treaties with, Obadiah says they're going to prevail against you. They're going to turn on you. And that's what he's saying. They'll eat thy bread and lay a wound under thee, and there was none understanding in him. Boy, isn't that so true? You just have to wonder, don't you? There's no understanding. You think about that for a moment. How in the world do we make some treaties with some of the most evil people in the world and think that those treaties that are on a piece of paper will ever stand? And we can throw money at them, but that's not going to make any difference when it comes down to really who's on your side. Notice verse 8, shall I not in that day, saith the Lord, even destroy the wise men out of Eden? I think sometimes pride can be an intellectual pride, don't you? I mean, you got to watch it here. Sometimes, people get filled up because they're smart and they're gifted and they're intellectual. One thing about a man that's smart, he ought to be humble. I remember Emerson one time said, and he was a pretty smart fellow. He said one time, everybody I meet is superior than me. And that's the truth, folks. There's always somebody that can do something better than you. Now, verse number 9, and thy mighty men, and that's when you begin to trust in your military, your strength, and your power, and how oftentimes has that failed? And look here, shall it be dismayed, and the end of every one of those on the Mount Esau shall be cut off by slaughter. And so their mighty men, their military is not going to save them. Oh, we need to be humble, don't we? We certainly do need to be humble people. Now notice in verse number 10, for the violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee. Now God's calling them out on this because of their sin, because of the way they had treated Israel, God's covenant people there. God's going to bring them to shame. He's going to cut them off, he said, forever and ever. Now let's jump down to verse number 12 for just a moment here. And what you're seeing is, but thou shouldest not have looked on the day. Now here's the background. I didn't get into this too much, but when Obadiah writes this particular prophecy that the nation of Israel, or at least the city of Jerusalem, had been destroyed and ransacked, and here Edom was right in there. They're like vultures, and they were there to grab all the spoils. That's the idea of stealing the last grape and getting under every secret place. They just searched out and got everything that they could ever take. And that's why he says, what you should have done, though, have looked on the day, thy brother in the day that he shall become a stranger, neither shall you have rejoiced. Now listen, it's a terrible thing when you think about this. There are some folks that will rejoice in the misfortune of others. That's a sin. And God's calling them out for that. We ought not to get any joy. It ought not to bring us any gladness in our heart when we see people mess up. Why, good night, you messed up, and so have I. We ought to have some empathy and some sympathy instead of rejoicing. You see, when somebody gets fired or someone gets hurt or someone, even gets what's coming to them, well, not to cause us to rejoice. God even says he doesn't rejoice in the wicked when they perish. How about that? Now notice verse number 13. Now here he said, thou shouldest not have entered the gate of the people in the day of their calamity. See, that's a terrible day. And yet they should have not looked upon their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have they should have laid the hand on their substance in the day of their calamity. Boy, I'll tell you what, there are people, and you know it, and I know it, and there are always going to be people like that that's going to take advantage of those who are vulnerable, those who that you can take advantage of. And that's another sin. We ought not, sometimes people aren't as quick on the draw as we are. You might take advantage over someone that doesn't have the understanding about something as you do. They might be down and out, and and you don't rejoice about that, nor do you take advantage of them because you can. Everybody's trying to do that anymore, and you can see how pride can get somebody to be so self-absorbed and be so wicked and not to care about the other person at all. And that's what's happening here. They rejoiced in their calamity. And he says, you know, they grabbed everything they could get their hands on because they could take advantage of somebody that was vulnerable. It's a sad thing. I'll tell you something. Everyone's going to have a day in which they're going to be vulnerable, and you better hope it's not somebody like Edom that's hanging around. Now, verse number 14, notice here, and he goes on to say something very similar here. Neither should thou have stood in the crossway. Now, here's what's going on. They were looting the place, and they were taking everything they could get, and they were grabbing the spoils of war. They were laughing at their downfall. They were gloating over it. And then those people that escaped, that is, escaped with their lives, they weren't killed. They're running from Jerusalem. And guess who's at the crossway? Who's causing the roadblock there? These people are trying to get out of town. And here he says in verse number 14 that neither should thou have stood in the crossway and cut off those that tried to escape. I mean, they were out to kill every last one of them, and they wouldn't even let somebody escape from that kind of calamity. Oh, can't you see how pride just leads to such terrible, terrible things? And I'm not going to even get back into that World War II business about how the self-righteous pride of the Nazis had taken such a horrible, horrible sins against the Jewish people. But you can see that that's exactly, they looted them, they took everything that they owned, they stole their homes, they took their possessions, threw them in concentration camps, didn't care a lick about their lives, and you can see how that pride caused them to count people as nothing. And that's what Jesus was saying back in Luke 18 about the Pharisees, who were so self-righteous because of their pride that they looked down and despised others. And that's a terrible, terrible thing. And that's why we started out in our lesson tonight by talking about most people really don't see how evil pride is and where that pride will take you sometimes. And boy, I'll tell you what, I just can't go there because we could give you an example of how pride has done some of the worst atrocities in human history. And so he'll go on to talk about things a little bit different as you get down to the end of the chapter. But boy, what a lesson about pride. The peril of pride, the deceptiveness of pride. And we ought to do everything we can not to get caught up into that trap. Hey, man, I mean, we really should. And so I hope some of the things we talked about tonight in this very short but profound book of Obadiah will help us remember that God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Be humble.